Hi everyone and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Content Manager at Goodlord, and today's episode is a recording of our webinar with David Smith, partner at JMW Solicitors, and Goodlord's Director of Insurance, Oli Sherlock. They give a lettings legislation update covering EPCs, short-term lets, material information and more, as well as, of course, some comments around the Renters Reform Bill. So without any further ado, we'll crack on with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning on a very sunny day. How nice it is to have summer back. Welcome to today's instalment of the Goodlord webinar series. Today, I'm joined by David Smith, a partner at JMW Solicitors, hopefully somebody that you know quite well. David, good morning. How are you?
Morning. I'm well, thank you. I'm enjoying the change from all the rain recently. I can actually see sunshine. I can actually see out my windows. It looks like it might even be a nice day.
It's actually extremely warm as well. It was like walking out of a plane this morning out of the house when I took the kids to school.
Almost
to nursery.
like it's August.
I know, like it's meant to be this way. But thank you so much for taking a break from the sunshine and joining us for the next hour to take us through a lettings legislation update. We're going to be talking today EPCs, consumer protection, material information, and much more. And I dare say, David, the Renters Reform Bill will make some appearance. We're going to try and move away from that as much as we can.
You promised to be no Renters Reform.
Well, unfortunately, David, we are dictated by our viewers today, of which we've got hundreds joining. So thank you so much for joining us. And whilst we are moving away or trying to move away somewhat from the Renters Reform Bill, we do accept that some of the points we'll talk about actually layer in and are pertinent to the Reform Bill too. So whilst David is absolutely sick of talking about it, and frankly, so am I, it's absolutely necessary given how, the gravity of that change for our market and our industry. So we welcome basically any questions. In terms of Goodlord, these sessions aren't really about our business, but you might be joining not knowing who Goodlord are. And Goodlord are a pre-tenancy platform. We help expedite the tenancy process, make it more simple, ensure your compliance, and really allow you to focus on all the other areas of your business that help generate maybe better quality of service to your landlords and tenants, and indeed generate hopefully more revenue. And we have product lines that help support that, ranging from rent protection insurance, for example, all the way through rent collection, lettings accounts, tenants insurance, all bills included. If you want to know more about Goodlord, you can visit our website at www.goodlord.co, where you can also request a demo and we can take you through, no obligation whatsoever, take you through exactly what Goodlord does. That's Goodlord back in its box. Again, these sessions aren't really about Goodlord. We're about helping support and consult with you as lettings professionals. And with that in mind, we've already broken the cardinal rule. We're 3 slides in, David. We're talking about the Renters Reform Bill. These are our own slides. We've done it to ourselves. But it's worth noting that we also have a Renters Reform Bill course. Hopefully, you've been following the work we've been doing over the last year or so. And we've been putting a lot of content together from different names and sources across the industry. We've compiled all of this into a course that you can access. This can be used to ensure that you're up to date with all the understandings of what the bill is promoting to do. Obviously, that's subject to change, and a load of other resources there available to you for you and your staff. If you want to take advantage of that, then please do let us know, and there'll be more information that follows to your inbox regarding that shortly.
Really worth doing. There's so much misinformation about the bill at the moment as well.
There is, and again, we're doing this to ourselves, but we're talking about it before we enter it. But that's indeed the problem. And I think also the problem is that people are taking what's been written as cast iron guarantee. That's what we're moving forwards. And as we discussed yesterday, David, there's a second reading to come, and hold on to your seats because there could be substantial change from that second reading.
I think the more salient point is that there's a possibility of Michael Gove no longer being Secretary of State. That's the current rumour around Westminster, and
is it really?
Secretary of State means a new broom and new ideas, and you just never know for sure what that means.
Well, if we were to lose the Gove Meister General, things would certainly shake up. And be interesting to see how much legs most of this has ahead of obviously an election, which is not that far away. So all to play for, by the sounds of it, from what David's saying there. And actually, from a process perspective, of course, it is all to play for. It's got to go through the House first and the House of Lords to get royal assent. And there's clearly plenty of challenge on a number of topics around the bill. So I think it's great to get up to date factual information, cut out any of the noise, but also, again, I would urge everyone to keep following the news coming out of Parliament, because I think there is going to be substantial change to maybe what you've learned to be true moving forwards. But to David's point, there could be even further change at the top of the tree, which would put us all going, what the hell's happening? I don't know.
We'd all just get up and go home for a while.
Yeah, indeed. Go and enjoy the sunshine. Okay, well, let's get into today's topic. So today we're going to be covering the increasing minimum energy efficiency requirements. Goodness me, that's a mouthful. Changes to material information, updates to shortlets, an upcoming review of tenant consumer rights, and expected guidance around damp and mold. You can ask any questions around these points, persons or nonetheless, or you can actually ask us anything else around legislation that is maybe troubling you, and we'll try our very best to answer those questions.
Please.
Indeed, just lettings, yeah.
Just lettings. Give me a chance.
Although it would be good to stretch David's skill set here and see how far
many random things does David know about. I've got fellow colleagues who do things like that.
Well, let's get into it. And once again, David, thank you for joining us. So let's talk about EPCs first. David, do you want to give us an update as to where we are? Because at one stage, this timeline was looking extremely certain. Everybody was clear what was happening, or they thought they were. I'm not quite sure we're in that world, are we?
No, I mean, it's all been a bit of a messy position. So, as I'm sure everyone is aware, there is a position that you're not allowed to rent out a property either as a new let or a continuing let with an EPC rating of an F or a G. You must have E or better. If you have an F or G rating, you must be, and you want to let it, you must either demonstrate that it's impossible to do the work, that the tenant won't let you do the work, or a superior landlord won't let you do the work, or that the work can't be done within the financial threshold. And you must register that with the appropriate website run by the government. I do tend to find that a lot of people do not register with the website. And if you're not registered, you are in fact committing an offence. So you should in fact register. As is well known, and most people I'm sure are fully aware, a lot of carbon is actually produced out of your home, which is not terribly surprising. You spend a great deal of time there. Most people spend most of the winter heating their homes with gas, which produces carbon. So carbon production in domestic premises is quite substantial. The government obviously needs to reduce our carbon emissions one way or another because we've agreed to internationally, and the planet probably requires it. I appreciate some of you may disagree, but this is probably not the time to get into a discussion about whether there's such a thing as global warming. Let's just agree that it's a good thing to reduce unnecessary pollution. The general drive has been towards improving that. So the government had a consultation where they said that they were aiming at a C. So anything with a D, E, F, or G rating would not be something that you could rent. And then they proposed a phased timeline of 2025 for new lets and 2028 for existing lets. And then everything went a little bit quiet. So lots of people responded to the consultation. The normal position on a consultation is that people respond, and then the government sort of produces a summary of all their responses and their response to the responses and what they propose to do. And none of that has happened. And everyone has, for some reason, which I don't think was actually, I don't know why everyone did this. I mean, and partly I think press and people jumped on this a bit. A lot of people were sort of treated the consultation as this is the government's plan to do it by 2025. And the closer we got to 25, the more people got a bit panicky about it. But actually, that was never the government's plan. I actually had a meeting with BEIS not so long ago where we started out by saying, what's going on here? And BEIS's response was, there is no government position until we respond to the consultation. And we haven't responded to the consultation. We may do so by the end of this year, but we probably won't. And therefore, until we've replied, there's no reply. And we've also got to now look at comments by Michael Gove. He's come up again already, twice in one webinar. He must be famous. We must have heard of him. So recent comments by Michael Gove, and of course, this has been driven somewhat by the result of the by-election in Uxbridge, where rightly or wrongly, the Conservative Party has received the message that environmental stuff may not in fact be the thing that's going to win them seats. And essentially what they're trying to do is put a line between themselves and the Labour Party on the basis that the Labour Party will cost you money with what David Cameron cheerfully used to refer to as green crap. So the position now is that it was always going to be impossible to get to C by 2025. The government's left it too long. If you turn around today and say everyone's got to make a C by 2025, it's just not going to happen. It's an impossibility. So that's already gone. Realistically now, there is going to be nothing before the next general election. So I'd be incredibly surprised if the government made any solid announcement on this whole issue prior to effectively the end of 24, which is probably around about when a putative election is going to be. I mean, they could draw it out into 25, but I think most people think they'll go for somewhere around October 24, all things being equal. I'd be very surprised at this stage if there was to be any significant announcement in respect of EPCC ratings. Now, of course, that has knock-on effects. So one of the great questions here is what support is available? The answer is not a hell of a lot, actually. And of course, the government's not very inclined to put more support behind something that they're not really announcing and they're not wanting to put too much money behind. And also the government's a bit short of money. So support currently is within the existing eco schemes, which are run essentially by individual energy provider companies, which they're required to do under what's called Eco 2. Those schemes are hugely variable in extent and availability. Some of them are available to private sector landlords, some of them are not. Some of them are only available to social landlords, which seems a bit bizarre. So there is a real shortage of available support at this stage. In terms of what to do, I think the answer is to do what you would do anyway, which is to maintain your properties. Obviously, if you're going down the road of maintaining a property, then I would suggest to you that it's sensible to look at maintenance that is going to improve its energy efficiency rating. So I'll use myself as an example. I actually have an air source heat pump. I don't have an air source heat pump. Well, I am fairly keen on green stuff, but I didn't do it just because I wanted to be green. I had to replace my boiler. It was going to cost me quite a lot of money to buy a new gas boiler. It was also going to cost me quite a lot of money to buy an air source heat pump. But the reality is the two amounts of money were not that far apart, given the size of the installation I needed. And I was able to avail myself of the now defunct renewable heat incentive, which actually made it more cost efficient to simply enjoy the electric heat pump. And obviously it means that my gas bills have dropped dramatically, which leads me to be very smug of late. So the reality is, I would say to people that you need to accept that this is going to happen. The timeline is now being stretched out and probably will, I would have thought you're probably going to look at a 2028, first phase introduction. It's debatable whether it will go all the way to C. The government now might do it in chunks and go to D and then C. But the reality is people do need to work on this. But I would try and do it within, existing tax deductible repair, as opposed to jumping out there and making radical improvements. The other problem with all of this is that the government, as part of this consultation, has also suggested it might completely restructure the way that EPCs work. So domestic EPCs specifically are measured based on how much it's going to cost to heat and light a property for 12 months. One of the things that's always entertaining about this is the number that's generated is always guaranteed to be wrong. I've never seen an EPC number that was anything other than total fabrication. But it also means that they can be uniquely sensitive to changes in energy cost. So, for example, there was a period about 2 years ago where oil prices really dropped. And it was possible to go and basically, if you had an oil-fired heating system and you got, and because it's basically, sorry, let me go back. Heat cost is done on a 3-month rolling average. So small fluctuations in prices don't matter. But there was a period about 2 years ago where oil prices dropped for a sustained period of about 5 months. And if you went and got yourself an EPC, you'd almost certainly manage to have jumped your rating up a whole band simply because the rolling average got beaten by the fact that oil prices stayed in a sustained low period. Equally, if you've got a gas-fired system and you did an EPC 4 or 5 months ago, the chances are your EPC would be worse because gas prices were up, and the 3-month rolling average of gas prices reflects that. And of course, it will take time for it to roll back down again. So one of the problems with all this is that it's done on money. And then the other problem is, of course, it can be defeated by silly things. So, for example, you might have a really energy efficient house where the gas boiler is running all the time to keep it hot. But you've got a really great rating because your property's covered in solar panels and the system gives you a credit for generation of electricity. So you might actually have a house that is very energy inefficient, but has a really great EPC rating, even though it's generating lots of carbon, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense. So there is another rating system called an ECC rating, which basically tries to measure how much carbon comes out of your property. And the government has intimated a complete change from EPCs to ECCs. Now, the problem with that is they haven't said whether they actually implied they would have both, but they haven't then said whether it's going to be an EPC or an ECC, whether they then take the average of the two ratings, whether they take the lower rating or the higher rating, and how that's going to work. So there's also the problem that energy performance and carbon performance are not quite the same. And at the same time as all of this, there are ongoing tweaks being carried out, which have created changes in EPC ratings anyway, in terms of the way that the calculation methodology works. And they're always being changed.
And on that point, David, Dan, good morning, Dan, says, I was speaking to an EPC assessor recently who advised they're petitioning the government to base the ratings off carbon produced rather than perceived efficiency, which I think is your point around ECC. We've also got a comment from Move. I am. Good morning. I don't believe you were christened that name. If you were, what an extraordinary name to have in this industry. Go reportedly made comments last week pushing back timeframe on ME's requirements for landlords. So there seems to be an awareness here that this is being pushed.
Quite an interesting one because he actually said something and nothing simultaneously. What he actually said was that we might have to turn down the pressure on landlords in this area. But then there was also a putative plan to force landlords to fit to not install gas boilers, and the briefing that went with it from his department said that he was referring to that. So yes, it's possible, but I mean the crazy thing is, of course, Go's announcement was a non-announcement because the ME's timeline had already been pushed back. There wasn't a ME's timeline, and so the silly thing about this is it's been over registered as Go pushed back the ME's timeline. But the ME's timeline didn't exist in the first place. There was no time to push back.
And you mentioned earlier about registering. Somebody who hasn't left the name, but good morning nonetheless, asked, could you confirm which website you mentioned we should be registered with, please? And I think this is put into the EPC registration point you made at the top of the slide.
Oh my lord! Now you're asking the questions. I'm going to do some rapid googling while we're talking.
And while you're doing that, we've got a question from Keely, which is around material information. I've seen the question, Keely, and I'll definitely revisit that when we get to that slide. And also, whilst you're Googling that, it sounds like that, through Go's comments and, dare I say, if you were slightly cynical, you could see this as a give back to landlords in light of the thing we're not talking about today, which is the Renters Reform Bill. Do you think there's any truth in that? Are they trying to balance the books here in terms of understanding how much pressure there's going on to landlords? And should we take this as a sign that the government is listening and understanding how difficult life is for landlords at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an aspect of that, but I also think that's a complete silly approach, isn't it? I mean, to say, we'll screw you in one area, so we'll make it easier on you in another. I don't think it's actually resolving the issues associated with the with being a landlord. I mean, and in practice, if you do it the right way, many landlords. I mean, this is why, for example, the Cameron sort of get rid of the green crap thing was such a terrible idea. Things like the Green Deal could have been quite an effective means of improving energy efficiency, and there are lots of things the government could do to make energy efficiency much more attractive to people. For example, it makes no sense at all, in my mind, that if my boiler is broken, I can replace it with an air source heat pump and get a tax I can claim that as a repair and get a tax deduction on it. But if I simply want to be energy efficient and replace my somewhat old, horrible gas boiler with an air source heat pump, I can't. And what I need to do is persuade the tenant to go and beat on it a little bit and without blowing themselves up. so that it's broken. It makes very little sense to my mind to have a system where you have to wait till something's broken before you fix it. If you're actually telling people that they ought to make improvements to their property, there should be a wider operation around what we mean by but what I think improvements basically should be classed as legitimate tax deductible repairs in specific circumstances.
I suppose it comes down to how important the thing you're trying to achieve is, and I suppose there's mixed messages coming out to the government of how important this is, and like you say, whilst I think it's probably a fair point that there's some balancing going on, it does take away from both sides of that coin how important either value is when you're balancing them and playing politics with them, because hey, life's a bit difficult. I mean, if it's important, then we should find a route to achieving it as quickly as we can. But I mean, it's quite an important part, and I think for landlords, and we've had these sessions before with agents and landlords joining us, they were materially worried about the cost implications of this at such within a time frame that seemed so short. But taking your advice, David, here, if you're doing iterative work and improvements, then the timelines feel manageable if we're talking about sort of 2028 potentially and onwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So the address that people are looking for is the PRS Extensions Register, which sits at prsregister.bays.gov.uk.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We'll move on, if we may, and we'll look at the changes to material information, because, as I said, we've got a question in here from Keely actually around this. But when it comes to the material information, can you just walk us through, David, what does material information include? Let's start at the top.
Well, this is one of the difficulties with NTS ELAT's guidance. Material information includes anything that a reasonable person would wish to know before entering into an arrangement to buy or rent a property. So the difficulty with it, and the thing that's always quite difficult for agents to deal with, is it could be anything. As long as it's something that's relevant that a reasonable person would wish to know, then it's material. Now, in practice, I tend to feel that people over-egg this. So, for example, I have lots of people saying to me, oh, it's material information to tell a tenant if the previous tenant died in the property. I don't think that is material information unless the death in some way is newsworthy, so that the property might be tainted in the public mind. But if you're going to tell people that people have previously died in a property, if it's not a new build, then the chances are someone's always died in the property. So what are you going to tell them? Someone died in this house at some point in the dim and distant past or more recent past. I just don't think it's a hugely relevant point. I know that some tenants feel differently, and you get tenants who complain that they would have liked to have known that the last person had died, but as a lawyer, we don't believe in ghosts, I'm afraid. So I accept other people do, but the law doesn't. So the difficulty is it depends on each individual case what is material. The thing that I'm much keener on most of the time is people shouldn't be misleading in the information they give. And I think the more common problem I tend to find is people being misleading. So, for example, excessively keen use of Photoshop, highly deceptive use of photographs or angles of photographs to obfuscate issues that are likely to be relevant. So, for example, not so long ago, I was looking to buy a house, and one of the houses I ended up viewing had a 24-hour shop abutting it next door, and all the photos had been taken so that 24-hour shop wasn't visible, which took some really tight cropping on particular sides. But I would say that was material information. To take a picture that chops out that there's a shop abutting your house, I think is misleading. Mm. Obviously, I had a personal investment in this one, so I'm bound to think it was more misleading. but I had a somewhat grumpy word with the agent after the viewing, because we turned up to the viewing and said, we're just not going to buy this house. It's not going to happen. We don't want, I mean, I'm not saying that people don't want a 24-hour shop next to them, but we don't. And it happens to be material. And I said to the agent, I would never have attended this viewing if your pictures had been properly done these are deceptive, and I just declined to go to any further viewings with that agent at all.
So it's essentially open to interpretation, I suppose is your point. And
this is why the whole material information guidance from NTS LAT, in my view, is a bit misconceived.
And with that in mind, we as I said, we had a question in at the top of the session actually from Keely. During the launch of Part A for lettings, my understanding was, as a general thumb, anything financially affecting the tenant must be displayed. With this in mind, my interpretation was the tenancy length should be displayed, as the tenant may be in a situation in 12 months' time where they need to secure a new abode, which would incur cost. I've logged onto the NTS site, and the Part A update of July 22 notes only rent, deposit, holding and security, and council tax. Do you agree, David, that this should be rent, deposit, holding and security, and council tax only?
No, and I don't think, and this is the problem with the whole NTS ELAT approach, is the danger of what they're doing is you assume if you say those things, you've done everything. So if a landlord has particular views about the type of tenancy they're prepared to offer that is very specific or is different from the norm within the market, then yes, I agree that is material information. And in practice, I think if your position to tenants is to offer particular tenancy lengths, and then that potentially also is an advertising point that you may wish to engage in, as long as the information you give is accurate. So I think that the difficulty with material information produced by NTS LAT is precisely the point. Was it Keely? Sorry, Keely.
Yes.
Raises is that you start to get to this dangerous position where people say, well, I only have to do the things that NTS ELAT have said. And if you read the NTS ELAT guidance closely, but whoever does, they do throw in a line that says, do bear in mind you have to do all material information anyway. These are just the things that we always say are material. But the reality is the things on the Part A list aren't always material. Because one of them is the council tax. If, for example, I run a business doing student lettings, I'm letting only to full-time students, then the council tax rating for the property is irrelevant because students don't have to pay council tax. If I'm going to advertise a property as with a rent that's all in, so as many HMOs are, and therefore the council tax is included in the rent, then I don't see that the council tax is material at all.
Mm.
So the difficulty is with these things, and this is where the Part B and C point gets quite interesting. They originally NTS sort of gave some hints about what they saw coming in the further parts B and C, which they've quietly done away with again because they were quite extreme, and they started to go down the road of you must tell tenants the proposed tenancy length and all kinds of things that actually were potentially variable. And wouldn't necessarily be material to the average individual. So there was a real risk that you start to go too far. And I think this is one of the problems with this. Is it especially as you tie portals into it, and then portals, not unreasonably structure their system so if you don't give them a council tax figure, they just won't put the property up. There's a real danger that NTS LAT is, and in fact, in my view, NTS LAT is basically trying to invent the law to make it what they want it to be. I mean, they tried at one stage to get the government to amend the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations to expressly list the things in their guidance as being things that were material, and the government declined to, quite rightly, in my view. So they've now produced this guidance, but the reality is it's a bit of a nonsense. Material information prosecutions are amazingly rare. They're not normally reported, so it's very difficult to see what the case law is. But every single one I've seen has not been about whether or not you told the tenant what the council tax figure is. They are always about people who are basically a little bit dishonest, either inadvertently or, in many cases, just willfully. So,
on purpose, yeah.
So yes, mad Photoshop is usually the number one situation that leads to threats of prosecution.
And with that in mind, what should agents be doing then at the moment? What stance can they take that puts them in a position of confidence?
Well, I don't think that the Part A guidance is overly onerous, and obviously I think that in practice you're better off to comply with the NTS ELAT guidance. But I think you should think about it openly. And what I try to encourage agents to do is think about it if you were looking to rent or buy a property. every agent must at some point have been in a position where they were a potential tenant or a potential purchaser. Would you be satisfied if you turned up to this property based on the advertising you had seen? Would you consider it was a fair representation of the property? If not, then you should be thinking about it carefully. I frequently see situations where, for example, in a state agency, a property has had a negative survey, and it's been clearly, and it's got a structural issue, and it's not on the advertising. But all that happens is it goes to conveyancing, a survey's done, and the buyer pulls out or demands a massive price reduction. It goes back on the market. But the reality is, you need to advertise it and be clear that there is a negative survey and the pricing needs to be adjusted. You can't just hope that someone will buy it, ignoring the obvious evidence.
Yeah.
Equally, people get very upset about letting properties, and landlords will say, "Oh, well, I don't want you to say that my property has a petrol station nearby or a 24-hour shop next door." If that's the reality, then deceiving people about that is only going to lead to problems later.
And also an absolute waste of everybody's time, frankly. If it's that person and that's an issue, from a practice perspective, it feels like an avoidable inefficiency.
The problem at the moment, of course, is that in many sectors of the economy and many parts of the lettings industry, tenants are so desperate they'll just take property on anything. And so agents are often in quite a difficult position, I accept, because landlords will often pressure them and say, "Well, I don't want you to advertise it, and I'll go somewhere else." But you really do need to bear in mind that prosecutions are rarely taken against landlords and vendors. They're almost always taken against the agent. And I should also point out that they're often taken personally against individuals. It is incredibly common in these prosecutions for an individual to be named where they can be identified as a co-defendant alongside the company. And that can be very painful as an individual experience.
Yeah, very much so. Just quickly going back to EPCs, got the question in from the person who didn't leave their name, and it fears that actually their Zoom crashed the moment we're answering the question. So just to confirm to you, the website you're asking for is prsregister.beers.gov.uk. So that's where you need to be going to register EPCs. Okay, that's really interesting around material information. So, I think having a self-check process there of, does it pass that test as you went through, is probably the way to go. There's not only changes to this, but also updates to how short lets are working. And, when we caught up, David, you felt this one was particularly pertinent and had wide-ranging effects across the industry. Do you want to take us through what's happening in the world of short-term lets?
So as many people may be surprised to discover, there's more than one bill before Parliament at a time. They're talking about other stuff too. And one of the really important ones is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. That is pretty much finished. And as soon as Parliament comes back to work in early September, it's going to be finished and going to charge off for royal assent. And one of the key elements about it is a short lets register, which is a national register of every property that is made available to someone to occupy. And the definition is to be occupied not as their home. So anyone who's choosing to occupy a property for a holiday or something like that, or is advertising on that basis, will be required to join a short let register. Wales is proposing to do its own thing on this. Obviously, when I say national, I mean England. Obviously, I'm not talking about Scotland or Ireland. Wales is going to do something similar using its own structure. But in England, there is going to be a short let register. There is already a consultation underway as to what that register will look like. And there's a consultation required as part of the legislation, but the legislation expressly says that a consultation can be carried out before the bill gets its royal assent and becomes a proper act of Parliament. So the consultation is already happening right now about the short let register, and that is a more than subtle indication, frankly, that the government intends to ram it through as quickly as they can. Bear in mind, from the Conservative Party's perspective, short let register is generally seen as a bit of a vote winner because it addresses issues in core seats that they want to keep in the West Country and through rural areas where they're under an enormous amount of pressure. and where things like holiday homes are generally seen locally as a bit of an issue. I appreciate for those of us who live in the southeast, a holiday home somewhere else is seen as something we'd very much like to have, and the ability to go and stay in, I don't know, Dorset or Cornwall is seen as a mega good thing. But locally, these are not seen as positives, and these are seats that the Conservative Party absolutely must hold on to if it wants to survive the next election in any meaningful form. So this is local politics on a national stage, but the register is far advanced, and I would be very surprised if the register is not launched next year and ready to go. So at the moment, it's hard I can't give you any more details about what it will look like, but I would advise you to go look at the consultation and consider responding to it if you've got short letting as part of your business, because you're going to have to sign up to it. I should point out that most European countries are on a short let register. If you've ever rented, for example, in France, you will actually get a specially formatted email through giving you the agent's reference number on the French short let register. And all of the major portals like Airbnb and other similar portals, other portals are available, are all fully signed up to this and are actually quite supportive of it. So it's definitely going to happen. There's no question that it's going to go through pretty quickly.
So on that point then, David, the transition between sort of longer term letting and short term letting, that sounds like that will become far harder to do and therefore present maybe challenges to revenue streams.
There's a second element to all of this, which is that there is a proposed new planning use class for short letting. So the proposal is and this can be done relatively quickly as well, the consultation on short letting has an associated consultation on a new planning use class for short letting. So if you want to change your property from its current C3 domestic residential and dwelling use, whether let or owner occupied, and want to short let it, you will need to apply for planning permission. If you don't do so prior to the short let use class coming into effect, again, probably pretty likely to happen next year, frankly. And the reality is, I would expect that almost all of those planning permissions will be refused. So of course, the short let register just really helps with the enforcement. And people think, oh, local authority enforcement, it's not that great. Local authority planning enforcement tends to be pretty effective and pretty robust, not least because they can prosecute you and do horrible things to you and make you knock things down and other exciting stuff. Local authorities are quite aggressive in pursuing planning prosecutions, and the short let register, of course, will make it very, very easy for them to do so. And of course, gives them a double-edged sword in the sense that they can prosecute you once for not being on the register, and a second time
they can.
And it will be quite easy because the chances are you're going to have to advertise your property with the registration number alongside it.
Yeah. And Monica asks, good morning, Monica. Will the short let register include one-off lets, such as short-term lets before the property is sold?
Yes.
It will be any.
Bear out, it's been called a short let, but if it's a letting for someone to use as their home, that's fine. If it's a letting not to be used as their home, then it will fall within the scope of the register. So this is going to affect a huge range of situations. So it's going to, one of the things that makes it really relevant to the bill that we're not supposed to be talking about is that one of the effects of the Renters Reform Bill has been for landlords in some areas to start switching into short letting. This will make it quite difficult to do so because you will have to register on the short lets register. If the planning use class has already happened, you will effectively be precluded from switching your property. So the reality, as much as I hate to say it, if you're seriously thinking about switching to short letting, you should do so now.
Very much
and
so.
Establish a usage as a short let property prior to the planning use classes being changed. The planning use classes are going to be pushed through before the Renters Reform Bill, precisely to stop landlords turning around and saying, "Oh, I don't like the Renters Reform Bill. I'm going to switch to short letting." So if you want to go short let, then you should establish a usage as short let now. Even if you then drop out and go back into the mainstream market, you need to establish usage as short let in order to justify the planning change.
And two questions coming in from people who haven't left their name, but once again, good morning nonetheless. First up, would a short-term let, David, be deemed as anything less than 6 months?
No, it's done at the moment. The legislation classifies it based on use as not as my primary dwelling.
And again,
so a short let register is misleading. It's really a holiday lets register.
Indeed, yeah. And do you think the short-term register will be a precursor for a full landlord register? Open brackets. Sorry, that's another Renters Reform Act reference. People are getting it, but we can't get away, of course, from the Renters Reform Act.
Well,
indeed,
and what they're now calling it, the National PRS database, is an element in the Renters Reform Bill, and
yeah.
And sure, a short let register lets you have a bit of a trial run. And I suppose one of the things that will be quite interesting is undoubtedly whichever entity ends up winning the tender for the short lets register is going to have a very free run at the National PRS database, for sure, whoever that entity is.
No, definitely. So in terms of short-term lets, quite a lot of change there. And unlike most things we're speaking about where, there isn't much confidence on timelines, and if anything, timelines being pushed back, it certainly sounds, David, this is a timeline that you have more confidence on, and actually something that agents really need to take note to be able to support landlords accordingly if they're working in this area of industry.
The government's pushed ahead with its consultations before the legislation has even got its royal assent. Is generally, I wouldn't say it's an absolute, but it's a general indicator that it's something they're going to go with. And when you couple that up with it being a local issue in seats that the Conservative Party wants to win before an election, it allows them to go on the doorstep and say, look what we have done about short letting in your area. So this is one of the situations where as you get close to an election, politics becomes very localized, because MPs need to be able to walk around their constituency and say to me, look what I've done for you. Make sure you vote for me so I can keep doing it. And so national politics becomes local politics. And that's why you get odd situations like the arguably quite specific ULEZ position in Uxbridge being taken as turned into a national position, that we won't do green stuff that's going to cost you money. And Michael Gove making comments that are then taken as reading as Mies for landlords is dead. And it might be, but this is where local politics really gets a run on the national stage.
No, indeed. And the noise will only get louder, I imagine, as we approach the election across different areas. In terms of questions, we've got one in from Clancy. This is actually back to the material information topic. Clancy says, with so many people now working from home at times, should broadband coverage be listed and made obvious to tenants in the same bracket as basic utilities? I recently lost my holding deposit, £350, on a property that I later found to have exceptionally poor broadband speeds, and therefore refused to sign the tenancy agreement. The entire process was a waste of time for all, especially a landlord who stopped advertising their property for 2 to 3 weeks. Any thoughts on that point, David?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have an answer for you, because material information is what's material to an average tenant. I think the courts would be reluctant to put broadband coverage in there. And I mean, I think you'd also got to bear in mind the courts will tend to also have always historically tended to say, well, I won't make you do things that tenants could easily find out for themselves. Because it's not terribly hard to type a postcode into a broadband checker and get an indicator of broadband speed. But at the same time, I take your point. I moved house myself and discovered that my broadband options in the house where I reside now were limited to Virgin Media, or possibly Virgin Media.
And I suppose from an agent perspective, they may argue that if they advertise on a portal, especially most portals actually right below the property give you an indicator and allow you to go and find this information for yourself quite readily. So it's I don't think it takes away from how pertinent the point is.
It's a great point, and actually is why material information is such a challenge, because what's material is hugely, and this is why it's so difficult for NTSLT and trading houses to pursue prosecutions. What is material is just so dependent on who you are. I completely agree in the sense that obviously poor broadband speed is a big deal for myself and for lots of people who need to work at home and carry out video meetings. It really matters. So much so that you can see entire adverts about it. But at the same time, there are groups of people that it's completely irrelevant to, and some people will probably be delighted if their broadband was terrible to get their kids off the computer games. It's a really good question, but it also shows how it changes over time. 10 years ago, that would be a non-point. Today, it's very much a point, and as things, for example, like Sky move off satellite dishes onto broadband provision, a decent broadband speed is fundamental, for example, if you want a substantive television service. So these kind of issues are just really difficult and really challenging. And at some level, I don't, while I'm not happy with what NTX has done, I think it's useful that they provoke the debate.
I'm conscious of time. With 30 minutes left, I want to try and sort of go through the next couple of slides. We've got one that I think is potentially quite important. So let's touch on, if we may, David, the upcoming review to tenant consumer rights. Can you talk us through what this is all about and how this will affect tenants, agents alike?
Right. Well, I mean, the short answer is it's probably a bit of a flash in the pan, but the Consumer and Markets Agency, the CMA, has a general regulatory view in relation to competition and consumer rights, separate from NTS, the LAT, and the Trading Standard Services. It has said that it's noted that tenants obviously are facing enormous financial pressure, and I'm not saying anything terribly surprising when I point out that rents are very high, especially as percentage of take-home earnings. The CMA has simply said it's going to carry out a review in order to determine whether it can use any of its competition powers to assist tenants, or whether it should use its competition powers to assist tenants. This got reported quite breathlessly in lots of places, and I get that. It's quite concerning. I have to say, having had a meeting with the CMA, I came away a bit less interested and also a bit nonplussed, in that it was patently obvious that the CMA had no particular view about what that review could be, and also wasn't particularly clear about which of its rights it could be using. And as Oli and I were talking about in the prep for this, there's an argument, although it's not a very sort of palatable argument, that the very high rents are a very clear example of the market working as it should. There is inordinate amounts of demand for relatively scarce rental properties, ergo rents are high. I don't think that's an enormous surprise that rents are high, and I don't think that that's an example of a consumer or competition law failure. It's unfortunate for sure, but I don't think it's a place that the CMA has any jurisdiction to go. And I suspect the reality is that their review will quietly fade away as they realise they don't have any significant powers that they should be exercising in this area. But I think go on, Oli, sorry.
I was going to say, in terms of your point around the free market, it's it kind of, like you say, working in my view as it should, whether we like that or not. And I think most people don't, and I'm definitely on that side. It feels grossly unfair actually in places at the moment, and it's actually mostly not people's fault either. There's a lack of support and foresight. It's hard to really see where the CMA can play a role here, surely, because the link between rents is directly 99% of the time down to that market, right? It, like you say, this feels like potentially a non-starter.
I mean, to be fair, when I met with the CMA, I was doing so on behalf of clients on a lobbying basis, and we very much saw it as going in and trying to get the CMA to hold the government's feet to the fire and say the problem here is you need to build some houses.
Indeed, yeah.
If you really want to resolve problems with housing, you've got to review the planning system. I suppose I'll betray a political view here in that I think you've got to really consider whether Greenbelt is right or wrong. I live in Surrey. It's easier to build a golf course here, and I live within walking distance of 6 of the damn things, than it is to build houses. I just don't see. I mean, obviously, I'll admit I'm not a big fan of golf, so you can
I got that impression.
You can take my views on that basis, but it just doesn't make any sense to me that I can build a golf course easier than I can build housing. I just don't think that makes a great deal of sense.
No, indeed. And to use a golf analogy, let's look at the courts, because at the moment they're performing over par, and the round isn't looking that good. There's a lot going on from a court process perspective, isn't it, David? And there's a lot of pressure still on the courts. It feels to me that we haven't really ever got over the COVID effect, and adding more legislative change on top of that, personally, I think brings only further pressure. Can you just talk us through what the pressures are at the moment, and what we're seeing in the courts?
Obviously, we had the position during COVID that in effect courts were closed. There was a ban on evictions of all types, whether it was at the end stage with a bailiff or in the mid stages with possession claims. At the end of COVID, things started to tick up, but actually there was quite a long period where things were quite flat. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that social landlords were not pursuing eviction very much. That has now changed. The last few quarters have seen some of the largest numbers of landlord eviction claims being lodged that we've ever seen. We're back to pre-COVID levels and rapidly extending beyond pre-COVID levels. But at the same time, the court service has problems that it's never seen before in terms of shortage of judges. So increasingly, a judicial career is not attractive to my fellow solicitors and indeed myself and to members of the bar, which might seem surprising when I tell you that a full-time district judge is starting is about £100,000. So it's not like we're not paying them decent money here. It's not bad. But the career option is unenticing. The most recent district judge competition fell woefully short in finding the appropriate number of district judges. They wanted about 300. They got somewhere around a third of that. The circuit judge competition, so slightly more senior judges, again, well-paid judges. This is about 130 to 140,000 pounds per annum, full-time. The circuit judge competition failed to find the 90 circuit judges it was looking for. Again, about a third of the sufficient number. So there are real difficulties in attracting people of sufficient quality into the judiciary. I mean, I suppose I'll be honest and say some of that is because you can actually get, if you're good enough to become a top-end judge, you're going to get paid significantly more money, I'm afraid, in private practice. So there is a real difficulty attracting people into judiciary. The work environment is not attractive to many people. The quality of the courts are pretty poor. They're in many of them are in very poor states. There are real shortages with administration staff. So often, although there's a shortage of judges, you still find situations where judges are sitting around unable to do work because there is insufficient cases prepared to put before them. And this is all leading to knock-ons. So at the moment, it will take at least minimum 4 to 6 months to get a possession claim heard. And I've had longer. I've got at least one case where it's taken so long for the court to even issue the claim that the Section 21, with its 6-month use it or lose it provision, has gone out of time. And we're going to end up appealing the whole thing, and we've made a complaint. And also our complaints aren't getting responded to either because the complaint service is so overloaded. I've had another case where in the Essex Kent area, I'm deliberately being obscure about exactly where it is, where the hearing has been cancelled 3 times because there's only one judge. He's allocated into that court for hearings, and he's been apparently ill, and there is no other judge who apparently can take over these cases. So I've had and that's a mortgage repossession where the person just hasn't paid their mortgage and has continued to just not pay. And now owes over £1 million when you take into account all the interest and everything else. It's really ridiculous situations occurring with these things.
And on the point in terms of the length and the importance of this, I think we're seeing as a business more landlords and agents switched onto the risk that's faced here. So we are seeing more and more questions around, for example, our rent protection product, which normally, David, sits around arrears. Actually, they're recognizing that the arrears is part of the problem, but the other part of the problem here is actually getting anything through the courts, and therefore legal expense protection and support becomes more valuable today than it once was. That support, though, is two-tone, because whilst we support letting agents and landlords through that process, there has been announcements around Help Us that will help support tenants, hasn't there, in recent times? Can you talk us through what that's suggesting?
Yeah, so previously there was something called the legal aid duty scheme, which basically meant that in most, but by no means all courts, there was a duty service solicitor who would basically talk to people who were coming in. If they were there for housing matters, would give them 5 or 10 minutes of advice prior to the hearing in order to try and keep them in their property. Now, the problem with that is, in most cases, tenants don't attend court. Two, by the time they get to court, it's probably a bit late anyway. And of course, from a landlord's perspective, their attitude's probably hardened by this point. They're not really up for negotiation. And they get incredibly annoyed as well when last minute defences are thrown in that should perhaps have been put in earlier. So the objective of the Housing Loss Prevention Advice Service, or Help Us, is to try and get that advice in much earlier and to have it available at an earlier stage rather than just in court. Whether it will change anything comes down to, one, whether it's sufficiently funded. It has got a bit more money thrown at it, but not a lot. And of course, whether tenants can access it. So one of the entertaining events of the last couple of weeks was that the government intimated it had changed Section 8 and 21 notices in order to put HLPAS into the tenants' notes. But then it transpired they hadn't altered Section 8 and 21 notices. What they've altered is the guidance notes for tenants that sit alongside Section 8 and 21 notices, but no one's obliged to give those tenants guidance notes. You're not required to serve them with the notice. So they're generally not served. Tenants, unsurprisingly, when they get a Section 8 notice, don't go tootling off to look at the government website on Section 8 and read the guidance notes for tenants. So there is some question as to whether or not the Housing Loss Prevention Advice Service will even be notified tenants, whether they'll be aware of it, or whether they won't just become aware of it at court if they elect to turn up, as is already the case. So there is some concern as to whether it will actually make a huge amount of difference at all. But I mean, the point I would always make, and I do make to landlords all the time, is wherever possible, it's better to negotiate. I often find myself agreeing situations where, for example, landlords will just say, look, I'll write off the arrears if you leave now. And I mean, it's always been my advice, but I would always say it's even more the case now, because you're going to wait ages and ages to get a possession order that by the time you get it will be so much money. The possibility of the tenant actually paying you is almost non-existent.
Yeah.
They'll pay you any meaningful sum, and you're just so much better off to try and get them to go early. I mean, there are challenges with that because, of course, you still have the problem, and it's an ongoing problem of local authorities either overtly or covertly or implicitly implying that tenants should stay in place. But more and more tenants are starting to appreciate that the local authority is not going to rehouse them at all. And so there does appear to be a bit more take up from tenants of the look, we'll just write it up, if you please leave option.
And it would be remiss again for me to not suggest that there are rent protection insurance products out there that can help support agents and landlords with this. Clearly Goodlord have one. There are others in the market. And ultimately having that peace of mind maybe is more important because of how the facts are changing and the processes are changing. In your view, David, moving forwards, what crystal ball time, and we'll finish on this note to appreciate we are rapidly out of time. In your view, what does the pressure on the court system look like over the next 18 to 24 months? Do you think we see any material change? Because it doesn't sound like there's huge investment here to turn this all tanker around. Do you think it only gets worse? What's your view?
It's acute and it's getting worse. So there's been a fairly widely publicised issue with bailiffs running out of PPE. So bailiffs don't run out of stab vests, so they're not able to take on more bailiffs, which is leading to cancellation or delays on bailiff warrants being executed. I am told that problem has been resolved. I don't know whether it has been, so things might improve a bit there. But the reality is that the Ministry of Justice has had significant cuts made to its services, and to its funding, and is likely to see a further set of cuts as we come through November. The Treasury has already made clear that pay for public sector workers, and being no doubt court service staff were striking as well for pay increases, will have to come from internal budgets. So I'm not convinced that funding will appear. The government has said it's got all this stuff about digital courts and more digital models, but they've essentially spent the entire budget on the criminal stuff. So So there is no money at the moment for the digital court plans, and the people who are driving it forward are all gone. So I don't actually see any prospects for significant improvement as we go forward. And one of the things that's really interesting is in letters recently to organisations I operate for, the housing minister has intimated that they won't push forward with the Renters Reform Bill implementation until the court service is up and running and operating effectively, which was a bit of a surprise as a commitment. But of course, the difficulty in part is that they're not really telling the truth about it. If you talk to the Ministry of Justice court staff, they'll tell you that there's a 60-day backlog for opening the post. But the Ministry of Justice doesn't recognise that exists. They base all their stats on the assumption that the post is opened immediately and things are dealt with. They don't appear to know about the fact that they're just not opening the letters.
And of course, I made the point earlier, this is in today's world without layering in legislative change. And depending on your point there, David, of which comes first, it could be quite damaging, actually, if it's the wrong way around. And the system isn't fully prepared to take on the burden of further work that's required as part of legislative change. So it's going to be a watch this space thing. But clearly, from your point of view, David, things are probably going to get worse before they get better by the sounds of it, which is something.
A spreading problem. The tribunal service is also increasingly overloaded. One of the things the Renters Reform Bill does is essentially force more. But essentially force more rent increases down the Section 13 route, more tribunal claims over rent increases, and the tribunal is already taking nearly 6 months to process rent increases.
Which I mean that process to me just needs absolute clarity, because you've got a landlord there not knowing really what rent they're meant to be receiving. It's sat with a tribunal that's going to sit on their hands because of the volume. There isn't financial investment, and why wouldn't people challenge it? There's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't challenge that to test the waters when your rent is increased.
Rent control, to my mind, and it's effectively rent control by delay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we do have to finish there. We've run over time. To the person who's just commented and not left the name, this has been really, really useful. Thank you, David and Oli. Are we able to get a recording for team members that couldn't be online today, please? Yes, indeed. We'll share a recording with you. What a nice note to finish on. Thank you for that comment. And David, thank you. Very, very insightful hour of time there to understand a bit more about some of the challenges the industry are facing. Hopefully detached enough away from the Renters Reform Bill, but do not worry. We will be back shortly with the next installment of this webinar series around more Renters Reform Bill detail, along with a host of other things. But for today, David, thank you, and to everybody joining, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.